Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to Defining Asia-Pacific SAF Landscape, where our panel will be discussing the current region's markets outlook, feedstock, and commercial opportunities for SAF across the Asia-Pacific region. My name is Harry, the Content Director for the Asia-Pacific Congress. Sustainable Aviation Futures hosts a global series of high-level SAF and aviation decarbonisation conferences across the world, bringing together the entire value chain to network, connect, and discuss the capabilities for scaling innovative energy solutions and powering a thriving aviation industry. Over the next 60 minutes, our panel of experts will explore the latest policy instruments and their impact in the market, where feedstock hubs are emerging across Asia-Pacific, looking at the current HEFA market and opportunities beyond, and what they are most excited about in the industry. This webinar is being hosted ahead of Sustainable Aviation Futures Asia-Pacific Congress, taking place in Singapore from November the 23rd to the 25th at the Marina Bay Sands. Today, we'll provide a brief snapshot into some of those topics covered across the 3 days of the event. The 3-day event features over 400 leading industry experts from across the entire aviation and energy value chain to discuss pending SAF projects and exciting feedstock and technology opportunities, the path to meeting the industry's ambitious targets, as well as the global SAF landscape and other innovative energy technologies emerging. If you'd like to join the event, you can reach out to me or my colleagues, whose details are on screen now. We're offering a 10% discount to all webinar attendees, giving you the best value if you book now. Fantastic. Before I hand over to today's moderator, a few housekeeping questions. We encourage questions throughout the session. Please do use the chat function at the bottom of the screen. As our speakers will do their best to get to you as quickly as they can. If not, please, we will look to follow up with any questions and provide a LinkedIn bio for you after this. This session is also being recorded and will be sent to you after this. With that, I would like to hand over to today's moderator, Shubhadeep Powell from Simply Flying. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. It's great to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're watching this from. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name is Shubhadeep. I work with Simply Flying, which is an aviation strategy firm, which has been around for the last 18 years. In the last 5 years, we've developed an extensive sustainable aviation practice. You may be familiar with some of our work. It's under the umbrella of sustainability in the air. We've published 2 best-selling books, volume 1 and 2. We run a long-run podcast, which has over 160 episodes and running, so I would recommend you check it out. We publish reports. We work with fuel providers, airlines, the lot, in terms of ecosystem building, SAF uptake, so on and so forth. But today is not about me. It's about our panelists who are here to discuss and answer some of the most interesting questions on sustainable aviation today. Before I get into it, I'd like to set a bit of context for what's been happening in the region and in the world so far. It's been a very, shall we say, exciting and interesting, and also, a fraught year in many ways because of things that have been happening. So very quickly, 2 years ago when we published our first APAC SAF report, the question really was whether the region was lagging behind. Europe had mandates, the US had tax credits, but Asia had roadmaps. But last year, the picture had changed enough that, we retitled our own report that we published, and we said the region had moved from aspiration to action. Japan was finalizing 10%, Korea was confirming a mandate, India was setting targets. Singapore, the first in the region, it came with a binding target and also a mechanism to pay for it, known as the Singapore SAF levy. So that was a trajectory we came into 2026 with. And then in late February, as we all know, war broke out with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz being closed. Jet fuel hit record prices, and it's not gone below, $1,500 per ton, if I'm not wrong. Now, the thing is, on paper, this should have been sustainable aviation fuel, SAF's moment, right? Every argument we've made in the years has been for energy security, about exposure to a single volatile commodity. The price cap narrowed between jet fuel and SAF. So it was, it was a strategist dream come true this year. But what actually happened is more interesting. Singapore, for instance, had to defer its SAF levy in March. In Europe, people asked for relief, airlines asked for relief, but they were refused. And global SAF production this year will be around roughly 2.4 million tons, which is roughly 0.8% of what airlines will actually burn. So, given all this context, I really want to bring in the panel now and ask, did the Iran war really change anything concrete? And if you could just give us some context around what's been happening with SAF in APAC, if you could set the ground, set the context, and also introduce yourself. So I'm going to go round robin, so to speak. So Isabel, if we could start off with you, and then I'll address you one by one.
Hi everyone, my name is Isabel Campbell. I'm the founder and principal advisor at Geopolitical, which is an energy and carbon consulting firm focused on SAF and really looking at the interaction between policy, voluntary scope 3 markets, and commercial decision making. And I think what has been, I spent 2.5 years at Air New Zealand prior to starting Geopolitical, where I built out our scope 3 corporate program and did a lot of work across feedstock and policy, bringing an airline perspective to the conversation today. And I think what's interesting when we look at the impact of the Iran conflict on SAF use is perhaps there hasn't been a massive uptake or a massive shift right now, but I think what the impacts will be longer term are really interesting. And I think we're already starting to see signs of where things are heading longer term. And I think for a long time, the conversation about SAF has been really focused on decarbonisation, and that's been the main driver for scaling SAF uptake. But when you only have one wire, you're at a greater risk of political headwinds changing and economic times, meaning that the appetite for SAF changes. And I think what the Iran conflict and sort of reflects is a growing focus on energy security and a broader range of reasons to support SAF use globally. So I think this narrative had already been starting to shift in the last few years, where conversations about regional economic development for domestic production, jobs, and energy security were all sort of broadening the SAF conversation. And I think the Iran conflict is really focused in on that. And I think if you look at Australia in particular, I think they've done a really good job of making the conversation about why we should look at SAF much larger by sort of bringing an industry coalition from all the way from crop growers to airports to fuel suppliers to airlines. All of those people together creates a stronger policy that has greater longevity. I think that's really important when we think about SAF. Any doubling of SAF this year would be amazing, but that would be taking us from a small percentage to a still fairly small percentage. But creating policy longevity that's really effective and actually gives the financing signals needed is really critical. The Iran conflict has drawn attention to the vulnerability of these global supply chains and increased the focus on and the value placed on energy security. And I think we've already started to see that with some of the low carbon fuels. Thailand across biodiesel was planning to reverse their blending percentage, and they have changed their mind about that. Vietnam has put ethanol blending in, and Australia seems to have accelerated some of their demand side mechanisms on SAF. And so all of these things, although have created uncertainty right now, are starting to broaden the conversation about where SAF sits in the global supply chain and the importance of it. And I think that will provide real value long term. But I'm sure there's something that other panelists can say, sort of where it's at right now.
Thank you, Isabel. Melvin, would you like to take the question and quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Melvin Tan. I am currently a sustainable aviation professional who recently pursued a master's in climate solutions at the University of California, Berkeley. And prior to Berkeley, I was a propulsion engineer working on SAF topics at Airbus. So I definitely echo a lot of things that Isabel mentioned when it comes to energy security. And just to give a few more examples, on Australia, they recently created a defense fuel qualification center to build out really that capability on fuels. So that really shows them seeing the importance of having that capability in-house, and also creating a green fuels accelerator to help fast-track domestic SAF production. And I think to your question, should there be, people are hoping, we're expecting to see really a big uptake and increase in SAF production. But, I think we also need to understand that for that to happen, it's tied to so many other things that needs development, like feedstocks, supply chains, which takes time to develop. So I think our expectations need to be we need to take that into account before expecting something so radical and fast in a few months. If it was so simple, I think this wouldn't really be a topic for us to discuss. So I think that needs to be taken into account.
Absolutely. Arno?
Yeah. No, thank you. So my name is Arno Broly, and I am the founder of EC Impact. So we are a sustainable aviation company here in Singapore, and mostly focus on book and claim, SAF certificate, orchestration among multi-registries. But to come back to your question about the war and all the impact. So to me, to be straight to the point, yeah, there is no single drop of SAF who came from the Hormuz Strait, but we can see two main, I would say, big impacts: the price volatility, which Isabel as well mentioned. So it doesn't mean that the SAF suddenly become cheap, but the gap, the famous 3 to 5%, 3 to 5x compared to jet fuel, narrowed down, I think, at the best to 1.8. So the volatility is definitely a big thing. What we can realize is that even if the SAF is physically and economically produced from a cost base largely independent than fossil fuel, we still compare SAF against price of fossil jet. So I think it tries the point of anchoring price, defining price of the SAF, which is still highly dependent to the jet fuel. And then the second thing is the sovereign security, the energy security, which is becoming higher. And we can see a kind of shift between SAF is a sustainability play versus, SAF will contribute to our energy security in the future. And that's what I think, to my perspective, would be one of the big win tail for the SAF development.
Absolutely. Kenneth?
Yes, hi everyone. Hi everyone. My name is Kenneth. I work for an organization called Global Center for Green Fuels. You can call us GCGF for short. Essentially, we are a not-for-profit organization funded by biofuels producers, mainly from US and Brazil, which are the majority of where these supply capacity and exports are coming out from. Essentially, our mandate is to promote and basically just promote the adoption of low CI, carbon intensity, which is a key topic here for SAF, and of course, sustainable biofuels in the three main transportation sectors. So of course, today we will mainly be focusing on aviation and that's SAF. I think coming back to the question on how this oil crisis or energy crisis has so-called accelerated or impacted things in the region per se. I think right now is really more, I think we are seeing like a perfect natural so-called excuse even or transition for SAF and also biofuels uptake as an alternative to conventional fuel and energy sources. I think our panelist here has already shared certain in-country case studies. I think maybe I can give a bit more of a market overview. I think jet fuel prices more than doubled since the peak of the oil crisis. So from roughly about $800 per ton before the oil crisis, I think to around about it's actually doubled. It actually was about $1,900 per ton during the peak in April. That being said, this is for Jet A1, right? So, but for SAF, if you really compare it, it did not rise by the same kind of margins or magnitude. And so essentially, I think what really changed, basically, I think two things in terms of the mindsets of people in this energy space. I think number one, I think like what Isabel pointed out, it's no longer about decarbonization or emissions anymore. It's about energy security and even sovereignty these days. So the energy security argument has become much more powerful and highlighted. Before the war, SAF, renewables, biofuels was often framed primarily as more of a decarbonization policy. However, the crisis we saw, now he's added a second or perhaps an even more important argument that SAF is also much needed for a domestic or even a regional, aviation fuel security strategy. I think point number two is that, as I said before, the SAF and renewable fuels price gap has temporarily now become much more closer, feasible, and even making it more attractive and considerable right now for the private sector. Yeah, so I think that's my 2 cents on how the Iran crisis has affected things. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, Kenneth, if you just stay with us, I know we were chatting just before this webinar began about this is the global context, but it's important for our audience to also get a bit of regional context in terms of what's really moving in APAC, the kind of projects that are happening, the kind of developments that are coming in. Something interesting came in from Japan recently. If you could just give us a quick overview of what's been happening, and maybe if Melvin and Arno would like to jump in after once Kenneth is done, that'd be great.
Sure. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Sean. Yeah, so maybe I can give an overview on the APAC SAF market developments and also the outlook. I think I can start on mainly first, what are the plans that we are seeing in this in the region, right? So of course we know if you follow like the pricing agencies, right, the Platts, the Argus, and all that, they actually came up with a this thing called the Straits, the FOB Straits. So Straits meaning basically Singapore and Malaysia. So we know right now Singapore and Malaysia has already one plant each, and actually I think Thailand this year has also started up with Bangchak right now. It's running full capacity on HEFA. So these are some of the plants that we are seeing right now being active in the region. Of course, there are also a lot more in China right now. But I think the outlook here we wanted to so-called look at is really what is to come, right? What is going to add on the volumes, the capacity, the supply. So I think very interestingly, like Shop pointed out just now. So actually just yesterday, METI, which is the one of the key ministries driving energy policies in Japan, they has finally officially published in their subcommittee meeting yesterday on the SAF targets. So I think initially at the start of the introduction, Japan, I think the initial target was 10% by 2030. However, it has now been reduced quite significantly to 1% starting 2030. And I think the industry likes to call it 1.35%. So because that's how Japan is setting this forth right now with a 5% cap by 2033 to 2035 and onwards. So this is what we are seeing right now in Japan. And I think interestingly, it's also a lot of people are looking towards Japan, not only about the policy, right? It's about the plants, the SAF projects that are currently developing. They are pending FID, which is the financial investment decision. I think as of right now, Japan has 5 pending plants in the works. 3 of them are ATJ, which is alcohol or ethanol to jet, and 2 which is HEFA. And I think a lot of people have slipped under the radar is that Japan already has 1 SAF plant right now, which is a pretty small one, a 30,000 kiloliters plant in Osaka by Cosmo Oil. So let's see how this so-called this reduction in SAF percentage targets is going to affect all these FID. I think that's something everybody's looking towards that. So this is one outlook in the region. Coming back a bit closer to heart where we are, I'm based in Singapore. Of course, I think the big news has already been out there that there's this project developer called Keppel, which has announced their technology licensor, I think about 1 or 2 months ago. That is also an ATJ project. So it will be interesting to see how things go, because if they were to be able to go through with this FID, and if we see some ATJ projects in Japan gets to go through as well, then it will kind of change these regions SAF play, right? Because then the production pathway would be diversified into a different pathway, which is alcohol right now, instead of the more mature HEFA pathway that we see right now. So I think these are some of the outlooks that we have seen that's quite interesting. And I think it's going to be more of like a regional ecosystem, because it's going to come into play when each of them actually decides to go ahead with the projects. It could change the certain, the whole ecosystem in terms of like supply chain and even export capabilities as well. Yeah. Thank you.
That's great. I was thinking, Melvin, would you like to add something, or should I just move to the next question?
I can just add something related to diversification of different SAF pathways. That's a very key part, and I think we shouldn't forget about that. Over-reliance on used cooking oil pathways like HEFA is not a solution for the long term. And so, as Kenneth mentioned about alcohol to jet, also within the region in Southeast Asia, there's a new startup called eFuel Southeast Asia, which partners with Infinium, a California-based startup, working on e-fuels. So I think that's really important that we look at the different pathways, including e-fuels. While they do cost more today, I think that's all the more a reason to work on them so that the costs will decrease when we need them. As we know, the famous sort of tipping point of 2030, when we expect SAF demand for SAF demand to exceed like the supply that HEFA can provide. So I think it's really important, I think, that we look at all the different pathways to help us reach net zero by 2050.
And maybe to add something, again, I haven't digested all the Japanese news, but to me, the national ambition still is maintained at 10%. But it's a kind of complementary new banning supplier obligation to start at the 1% on the supply side for 2030. So what I don't know, and again, need to be digested a bit, is that if it doesn't seem to me contradictory, but it's more a kind of, the demand, the signal, and the supply obligation as a kind of policy bundle.
Absolutely. If I can just, I'd like to go back to Isabel for the next question, which is, we keep talking about opportunity and progress every year. So if you could just help us contextualize this and, how would you score the last 3 years, for instance? Tell us about one APAC market that moved faster than you expected since, say, 2023, 24, maybe one that disappointed you. And just contextualize it for us. What really happened? Was it policy design? Was it incentives? Was it feedstock? What exactly affected these things? And if we start with Isabel and we can round robin this again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you start to think about what the SAF market has been looking like and how it's been evolving over the last few years, particularly in the APAC region, kind of highlights, sort of want to realize quite how varied the APAC region is. And I think depending on where you look, you'll see different progress. I'm based in New Zealand, and so in New Zealand, we've seen no progress on policy at all. I think there's a lot more promising signs elsewhere in APAC, and so I'm very pleased to see what's been happening. And I think a few examples of where there's been a lot of progress is Australia, which probably didn't have almost any SAF policy a couple of years ago and has been putting a lot of pieces in place to really grow their industry, which is fantastic. And they've actually just released a new consultation today that's really interesting, and maybe we can talk about later. But I also think what's interesting is where Singapore has been heading. I think Singapore gets a lot of coverage. I think it's probably justified given they're actually taking the steps to implement their SAF levy. I think when you look at APAC in general, there's a lot of signals about targets, and I think Japan's a good example of that, where people are indicating where they're heading, and I think that's a really critical first step. But what actually gets legislated is what will occur. And so we need to see more legislation and implementation across the board. And so I think what Singapore's shown is that they've set ambition, they've designed the scheme and the mechanism to enable it, and then they're putting all the steps in place to actually make that happen. So their SAFCO is, figuring out the back-end traceability systems, and they've just partnered with Trovio, which is doing the attribute distribution. They've got the ISCC CORSIA trader certification. They've been doing test purchases with commercial entities, and they've been doing a lot of engagement. And I think those are all the things that are actually required to take policy and ambition from just ambition to actually outcomes. And obviously we haven't yet seen it be fully implemented, so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think a lot of the signs of what we're seeing in Singapore are indicative of something that's quite well thought out and will create actual SAF demand at scale. I think on the sort of flip side of where I'm a little disappointed, and I think we've already talked about a little bit, Kenneth outlined that Japan side. When I was at Air New Zealand, I did quite a lot of modelling and scenario analysis about how SAF mandates and targets across the region would be factored into SAF volumes in different locations, emissions and cost. And, I think justifiably, you kind of assume that when a country like Japan sets a 10% SAF target, that it will be around 10% by 2030. But it seems that what's actually the minimum requirement now is 1% at 7 imports. And so that's very, very different. And I think Kenneth has already talked about that impact that might have on those facilities. But often people talk about, we need supply before we can have demand signals and demand policy. But if you've got flaky and kind of inconsistent demand signals that might change at any moment, that doesn't give confidence for suppliers. And that means that there's not likely to be supply when you want to implement a mandate or a requirement. And so I think it would be great to see more implementation and actual legislation across the APAC region. I think we've seen a lot of progress. There's a lot of great roadmaps that are going to pave the way going forward. And each country's been thinking about what good SAF policy would look like for them. I think now it's taking that step to being like, what does this actually look like, and how can we give confidence so that the facilities that are needed to meet those ambitions are actually put in place?
I don't know.
No, I mean, Isabel really described in a very good way about the model. Singapore is, of course, very innovative on the way and the levy. The only potential caveat I would add is that, specifically in APAC, I think the aviation industry is mostly dominated by a low-cost carrier. If I'm not mistaken, around 60% of the available seats. So it means that each time you take $1 or you add $1 on top, there will be at a certain point of time potential, I would say, impact on the traffic. So that's why it's really something to manage with care. Of course, Singapore, SAFCO, CAS, and all of that did all a great calculation, and the current levy today is bearable. But it's something that, to keep in mind is that $1 removed from the aviation industry would have a direct impact on the GDP of the countries. So it's just some lever to play with a lot of care in the future.
Any quick thoughts, Kenneth or Melvin, in terms of what worked, what didn't work, and why you think it didn't or did?
Sure. Maybe I can just jump in first. I think just to paint a different picture from Isabel and Arnold here. It's quite a rosy, optimistic picture so far. I think not to jump on the not to dampen down any expectations here in Singapore, where we are based in, and we work quite closely with certain of these project developers as well. I think yes, I think it's a good sign, right? But ultimately it's been delayed, right? Delayed because of the situation, delayed because of the economics. But that being said, once this ecosystem, once the policy is quite clear, then I think you can see, project developers start to come out, right? Because then you give the it's not even incentives, right? You give this kind of encouragement, this kind of good signs that there will be demand out there, right? So then you will attract this kind of investments, whether is it from local companies, or you will even see foreign companies coming in. So I think for Singapore, I think it's still wait and see in a sense. We will have to wait for next year to see, and also of course for new plants to come up, it wouldn't be so soon. It will be like 2030. So I think that's a good signal in terms of at least there's a policy ensuring that there will be demand, and then hence bring in more investments. But I think if I can look at the ASEAN region or Asia region, I think in terms of so-called disappointing per se, I think I would just be picky in terms of countries that have mentioned that they have some kind of targets, right? Not mandates, targets, but then they didn't enforce through so far. I mean, the quite an obvious one is actually Thailand, right? Because Thailand, I think for the longest time, they had a target of 1% by 2026. And I think a lot of people in the industry kind of misunderstood it as a mandate in 2026. Unfortunately, it's still a target. And unfortunately, we are now, deep into Q3, and there's still nothing coming out yet from there. And that being said, I think, it can also show you that with this kind of flaky so-called commitments or policy, you will kind of disencourage project developers or investments in the scene. Because, for example, I think right now there's only one up and running plant that by Bangjak Group. Right now I think it's doing well, it's running full capacity, but a lot of it is exported, yeah. So there's really nothing really domestically. So that's one thing to look at as well. And I think in the past couple of maybe 2 to 3 years, there were other projects that were in the pipeline. There was also talks of two more HEFA SAF plants to come. One by the other major oil refinery that has not come because of this kind of poor policy commitment. And there was actually also talks of an ATJ plant that was supposed to come, with regional partners. I think some were from Japan as well for a joint venture. But that has not come, and that's actually quite a shame, because if you look at Thailand, it's quite it's quite abundant in terms of this kind of feedstocks for that is needed for, let's say, ethanol and all that. So yeah, I think ultimately the takeaway here is about clear policy, clear commitment towards it, and I think all these will actually drive the demand. Yeah, thank you.
And if I could just add one point to that question, I think I would love to see more regional collaboration. So today, I think every country is creating their own SAFs, mandate or strategy, and every country within the region has its own strengths, and they're complementary. In fact, you have some countries, as Kenneth mentioned, who are rich in feedstock, other countries who have a lot of air traffic, and so that willingness to pay and everything. So if there was a more regional approach to SAF, I think it would definitely benefit the broader region and every single country in that space. I know that ASEAN briefly floated the idea of an ASEAN alliance for SAF. We'll see how that plays out, but I think looking at the bigger picture and seeing how to collaborate on this would definitely benefit the broader region.
I think that's a great way to sort of segue into what I really wanted to ask in the next question as well, which is, let's talk a little bit about mandates, because they've been, in the news, we've been hearing about them. But what's really interesting about mandate is mandate design, right? For instance, there was this big announcement, I think last week, about Brazil, which has put in a big mandate in place, which actually focuses on emission reduction targets along with, say, a SAF mandate. So unlike APAC, which is volumetric in terms of, say, SAF uptake, Brazil has mandated emissions reduction, and it has also built in book and claim right from the beginning, which is another interesting approach that's been taken. So whereas in APAC, many countries will consume SAF that is not actually produced in their country. For many, SAF will be shipped across the region. And given that these questions are not really addressed in terms of emissions reductions, book and claim, so on and so forth, I just wonder if you could shed some light on whether this mandate design is the right choice, or whether mandate designs themselves should be better in the region.
Yeah.
Arno, do you want to take this first?
Yeah, maybe I can start. So it was a big announcement actually, and I think we haven't all realized what it means, because it can even change a lot of paradigm that we had for people who are involved in SAF certificates, Scope 1 and Scope 3 environmental attribute transfers. But to my understanding, and again, we still need to work on it. What is very interesting in this example is the fact that the aviation obligation is framed around the GHG reduction, not simply a fixed SAF volume. So it means that, and which I hope when we talk about policy in the future, is that the interest, the mandate is not on the volume of SAF, but on the carbon intensity, instead of treating every liter of SAF, whatever technology pathway it is, as equivalent. And the fact that the Brazil law would support this market-based mechanism, the book and claim implementations, would have a potential effect. And again, I put a lot of caveats. I don't know if it's all validated by those SBTi, GHG protocol, and so on, that to transfer environmental attribute, for example, from an airline or project developer to a corporate, it might not only be for a voluntary basis, but could be as well on a mandatory basis. So question mark, but it's really something to follow very carefully. But yes, the voluntary mechanism for Scope 3 buyers might shift from what we know today. Again, it's Brazil focused, Brazil only, and being as you see impact, especially I would say making a lot of advocacy on book and claim. The fact that the country itself built by default and by law a book and claim based mechanism is I think is a great progress, because we do believe that scalability of SAF will go through a book and claim mechanism.
Right. Before I come to Isabel, just a quick reminder to our audience that we will be taking some questions right at the end of our session. So if you have any questions, please send them in the chat and we'll look at them, and hopefully we'll find time to answer a couple of them right at the end of the session. Back to you, Isabel.
Yeah, thanks, Arno, for talking through that book and claim side. And I haven't done a deep dive into it, but I know that RSB was doing quite a bit of work on this before it was announced. So I think if you're wanting to do a deep dive, there's quite a long report that you can have a read of, and it's got some really interesting diagrams. But I think what's interesting from that is that shift towards emission intensity rather than volumetric. And I think if you look at global policy designs, sometimes what the policy says on the tin is not actually how it's designed. So for example, you look at the UK mandate and it looks volumetric when you read it, but actually it's a credit trading mechanism around emissions. So it's sort of emissions intensity based. But I think what's interesting is when you think about the pros and cons of each design, and ultimately I think you don't want a completely fragmented and complex policy landscape globally, but a country needs to design a policy that works for them based on their unique context as well. And I think when you think about volumetric, it has some advantages in terms of it's quite easy for people to understand and easier to implement than emissions intensity, and that can have value. I think SAF is complex for a lot of people. Even when talking within an airline, a volumetric SAF percentage is much easier to communicate than starting to talk about emissions intensity. It's just a different language for your average person. But at the same time, if you're wanting to use SAF for decarbonisation, having a decarbonisation-based mechanism aligns the incentives in the right direction. And I think what's interesting is what Australia is thinking about doing. And so this is super hot off the press. They only released their consultation document today. And so I had to scan through the 86-page doc to see what it was going to say. And what they're proposing for their demand-side mechanism that they're working on is starting with a volumetric mandate up until 2035 before transitioning it towards a carbon intensity mandate. And I think that's really interesting because that's sort of understanding and looking at the pros and cons of each to design their system around that. So like volumetric initially will be easier to implement and supports earlier stage projects as the market forms that might not have optimized all their processes to maximize carbon intensity, but they've sort of indicated the direction of travel and that will be carbon intensity based. And I think that's really important because although volumetric might work for some regions, I think we want to avoid the place where we're not using quality sustainable SAF that has high sustainability credentials. There are some feedstocks that have worse carbon intensity than fossil jet fuel. And so I think regardless of whether they're looking at volumetric or carbon intensity, there really needs to be a minimum sustainability threshold and carbon intensity requirement for policy. And I think that's really important to maintain the social license for SAF. If we start cutting down forests around the world to produce SAF, that's not going to maintain it as a valid and valued lever for aviation, and that would put us in a challenging place. And I think you also look at the voluntary market. There's a real focus on sustainability credentials, and so we don't want a complete divergence between regulatory regimes and voluntary markets. That increases complexity, it increases the chance of arbitrage, and you don't want completely different credentials across different markets. So I think design the mechanism that works for the country that works, but make sure that whatever we're designing has the right sustainability credentials that SAF keeps its reputation long term.
Thank you, Isabel. Melvin, any thoughts?
I'll add that this whole carbon intensity approach to doing things in California, there's a very famous law called the Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which is also based on carbon intensity reduction for transportation fuels in general, being reduced over time. And they also have they add to this mandate sort of a stick approach. There's also carrot, which is a trading of credits. So if you're doing better than the mandated level, you get to trade it with other fuel suppliers who are above the carbon intensity standard. So that's also a potential tool that I think governments could consider to add a carrot to the stick. But I think if we look at all the different regions, there are different types of ways to implement such mandates or incentives, and I think governments shouldn't be afraid to explore with different approaches, because ultimately I think this field of sustainability and aviation is still relatively new, and so I think everyone's figuring out what works best, and I think it's a great learning experience for everyone.
Right. I'm actually going to bring Kenneth in with the next question, which I was going to come to feedstocks, which is the burning question that everyone keeps talking about, right? In terms of feedstock acceptance, finding the right feedstock, aggregating feedstock. There are multiple moving parts to this question, and Kenneth, if you could just give us some context for what's really happening in APAC, what are the opportunities, what are the pitfalls? And I believe in our Q&A section, a number of questions have actually come in about feedstock itself, with the focus, I think, quite a bit on India as well. So, I mean, let's see how much of it we can get done in this, round about feedstocks. But I think it's worth talking a bit about how feedstocks are evolving in this region.
Sure. I think thanks for that. I think the question here is about competing feedstocks and also for the different pathways for SAF, right? Is that right? So yeah. So I think to dive on it, I think my personal take is that because right now today the focus is on aviation here, right? And I think we are talking about feedstock competition with the other transportation sectors that are also going through their own decarbonization efforts, right? So for example, I think since the energy crisis, I think we have seen more countries in the APAC region, especially in Southeast Asia, trying to increase their road transportation biofuels mandate, right? So for example, biodiesel, we've seen Indonesia, we've seen Malaysia trying to scale, actually even Thailand temporarily going up to B20. And then even for ethanol, I think earlier on one of the panelists has already mentioned that Vietnam has started about 3 or 4 months right now in terms of moving up to a E10 blend. I think we're starting to see Philippines potentially trying to increase as well. And even end of this year, I think Thailand is due to come up with a new national energy plan. I think the draft is already in the works right now. So I think we start to see more and more so-called markets, regions, and countries are trying to increase all these kind of renewables, right? And let's not forget about maritime, right? I think maritime, they're also talking about biofuel, which is really right now B24 could go up to B30, and I think we're even seeing like alcohols, right? Ethanol, methanol, being widely discussed. So I think the main takeaway here is not about which transportation sector should dominate or should automatically win in this feedstock competition, right? Because for example, if we look at the two main maybe the main pathway for SAF right now, of course it's HEFA, right? And a lot of it is from UCO. And of course, the second most so-called plausible pathway in most people's mind is of course ATJ, where ethanol come in. I think once you look into all these, right? I think it shouldn't be about whether road, marine, or aviation is going to compete for them, right? I think the question is really where does the molecule deliver the greatest additional emissions reduction, and of course for the overall ecosystem the greatest strategic value, right? Because, for example, let's say if we talk about UCO, which is kind of controversial depending on which part of the world you are in, right? So with UCO, the economics will ultimately, I believe, will increasingly determine the allocation based on the economics like cost, right? So, for example, if the same ton of UCO can go into, let's say, HVO for road transportation, and then if you also see it for HEFA for aviation, if you compare it that way, right, then it really depends on looking at the policy also, because the policy needs to make sure that we are not simply moving molecules between the different transportation sectors, and also just to claim additional decarbonization benefits, right? I think coming back to that point is that one last thing is that, sorry, can you all still hear me? Yeah. So I think the one last thing is that if once we start to look at competition of feedstocks between the various SAF pathways, between the various transportation sectors, I think the danger here is that we might end up creating a bidding war for the same ton of feedstock or biomass, if you call it. So the objective shouldn't be to move these kind of feedstocks from one sector to another. It should be more about creating a more sustainable kind of a pathway, kind of like an ecosystem, and put each ton and each molecule where it delivers the greatest climate benefit. Yeah.
Right. And any further thoughts on feedstock? One of the questions that's not just been coming in Q&A, but also I've been struck by when it comes to feedstocks is if you have availability of feedstock, but it's essentially spread across the problem you come come up with is aggregation of feedstock, right? Who pays for aggregation of feedstock? How do you build the mechanism for it? If, for instance, it's agricultural residue or agricultural, with small, safe landowners, farms in India, or if it's aggregation of UCO for a large country like India, where India is largely importing UCO from China, how does that mechanism sort of start getting rationalized in the market? Is that something that you'd have an opinion on?
Yeah, maybe I can just have a word of it because I was working in the Philippines, for example. We had some ongoing discussion with Thailand. So feedstock is always, I would say, we all know that everything starts with a feedstock, but the long-term agreement, purchase, and at certain price determine a lot of the bankability of your future project. And it's very complicated, especially for UCO, when you can go to each and every papa mama shop to collect your and to aggregate. So that's why, and based on what have been said previously, the scarcity of UCO, which would happen by 2030, make unavoidable the diversification of the feedstock along the development of the pathway. For me, not entering about the details, as you say, who pay? Because that's always a problem. So certainly a combination of producer, long-term off-takers, maybe infrastructure investors, but it has to be somehow in the price, and it is somehow in the price, a big component of the price breakdown of the SAF. But a lot of focus have been done on the refineries or capital allocation to infrastructures. But I guess some capital we need to move upstream into the collection and the pre-processing infrastructure for the feedstock, because without the kind of proper supply chain for the feedstock, bankability of the project will be definitely, I would say, at risk. So when I talking about the Philippines, on non-solar coconuts, on the fisher traps, on the chicken manures, or various new feedstock for the Thailand, it's always one of the weak points is sustainability of the supply chain related to the feedstock, the supply and the commercial value of the feedstock.
Right. I know we're getting almost to the end of this panel, so I quickly want to get each of your opinion just to round up, what's been a really interesting discussion. In 1 minute, if each of you, beginning with Isabel, could tell us one thing that APAC has done that, the rest of the world could copy, and one thing that APAC has not done yet, which it should be learning from its counterparts across the world.
I think from just one country where I think something's been done really well is with the design of Singapore's SAF levy. The intention is that the attributes are passed on to the airlines, and that will reduce their CORSIA obligation. Obviously, for Singapore, all SAF that's uplifted is international. I think that's really critical. If we're designing mandates that are covering international uplift, I think that all SAF should be CORSIA eligible and should be reducing airlines' CORSIA costs. Otherwise, it's just adding cost for no real reason. But that's not what we're necessarily seeing around the world. And then sort of not an exact answer to your question, but something that I would love to see in the APAC region is I would love to see some policy in New Zealand. Maybe they'll be spurred on by progress in Australia, but I think getting some actions that we can sort of make sure that New Zealand doesn't become the dirtiest place to fly to would be a fantastic step. So that's something that I'd like to see coming up.
Melvin?
Yes, so I think that something I like a lot about Asia is that there's a focus a lot on what SAF can bring in terms of added value, in terms of jobs. So it's instead of being seen as, what are the extra costs, etc. So I think this whole concept of SAF, it really is an enabler for a new economy, for jobs, and that approach I think increases the momentum of progress versus if we just simply talk about costs and how much more people would pay. So that's an approach that I think is important to keep in mind. And then, of course, something that I would love to see more of is regional collaboration, as I mentioned. I think if we would get some alliances or between countries, especially when it comes to their SAF ambitions, it could definitely benefit the region as a whole, especially when it comes to energy security.
Kenneth?
Sure. Yep. I think maybe one thing that APAC or Asia can actually so-called be a case study for the West. I think maybe I think Singapore, right? I think the Singapore's central self-procurement model. I think it's something quite concrete. So basically, it's all about demand aggregation through a central mechanism. Rather than asking all the other airline out there to solve the self-procurement problem themselves independently. So I think that's important because SAF's problem isn't really about production anymore, right? It's more about all the different, the issues are more fragmented, right? So I think having a credible aggregated buyer here, gives producer much more greater, confidence in terms of, visibility, and also potentially makes projects more bankable when you know that there's really a one single buyer, a centralized buyer out there. Yeah. So I think that's something, a case study that we can highlight.
That's great. Arno, to close off our
Yeah.
discussion so far, if you could quickly tell us about one thing.
I'll try to be quick. So very proud about the model Singapore put in place, really unique. Ideal, getting inspired on the from moving volumetric SAF toward the carbon intensity. And why not in the future bundling various carbon intensity reduction from different vehicles, and why not CDR and some others to accelerate, the net zero and I would say the climate change. But because APAC is geographically very fragmented, so really emphasizing the SAF certificate, environmental attributes through book and claim across Asia countries and beyond would be really something beneficial for the industry. Yeah.
Great. We probably have time for a couple of audience questions. One of the questions that interested me, and of course, you can choose a question of your own as well, is this is always asked, right? Can SAF only survive with government subsidies, or do you think there's a future in which technology will evolve enough for SAF to come to at par with jet fuel or even lower, realistically speaking? If anyone wants to answer this question.
Is there any government subsidies in APAC already? Or?
I'm happy to add a little bit to this. I think in part it will depend on where the jet price is in future, right? When jet's 2 times normal fossil jet, then it becomes a lot easier to be at parity. And so, but when you look at regions like Europe, they're effectively increasing the cost of fossil fuels by the ETS cost associated with it. And so if there's an increase in carbon tax, that might sort of bridge the gap between the SAF premium and the jet price. But I think when you look at where a lot of the SAF uplift has happened to date, a lot of it has been in California and North America, and that's because of the significant subsidies. I think it approximately halves the premium by having those incentives. And, from a voluntary uplift perspective, that's definitely more attractive. And I think a lot of the Scope 3 voluntary market uptake is also kind of going through that market because you can just get the same SAF attribute more or less for half the price. So I think it'll be interesting to see where it evolves. I think there are some fundamentals about SAF feedstocks that might be hard to bring down in terms of, logistics and collection and aggregation of feedstocks, or, the fundamentals of HEFA feedstocks don't really lend themselves to getting below fossil jet at the moment. But be interesting to see. I think there's a long way to go on technology development to sort of advance some of these options that might actually be cost effective. I also think you have a pretty tricky piece where waste, once someone wants it, becomes valuable. And so that, some of these waste feedstocks are really cheap at the moment, but they might not be cheap once everyone starts putting them in their SAF facilities. And that could change the dynamics a little bit. But I don't know. Anyone's guess about where it will head, I think. But there's a lot of work to be done to bring it down.
And on just the topic of incentives, I think we have talked a lot about the role of governments in this webinar, but I think also airports play a very key role in this. You have London Heathrow's SAF incentive program for airlines to incentivize that, and also I believe Brussels also has a similar program. But I think there are opportunities within the region. I recently read an article about how there's a lot of renewable energy curtailment in Asia, notably in China as well. And essentially, during curtailment, you don't have enough demand to use the renewable energy that's being produced. And if you could really use that for other types of SAF like eSAF, I think that is definitely an opportunity to consider, and that could potentially change the economics of the fuel in the future.
So maybe I could just quickly add on to that. Yeah, I think, in terms of subsidies, right? I think this topic is really kind of shied away here in the Asia Pacific region, right? Where, not just on SAF, really on, even biofuels mandates and all that. So I think maybe just to flip the question a little bit from the previous one, is what we think that, APAC can actually contribute to, what the West can actually learn from Asia, right? But I think maybe Asia can also learn a thing or two from the West. I think like what both Isabel and Melvin has raised some examples here on UK and Brussels. So I think we can see right now in the West is really trying to turn the ambition into bankability, right? So Europe has raised those few examples that you mentioned, especially with the UK now trying to address it's really more about revenue certainty for producers, right? So I think coming back to look at Asia, Asia Pacific itself, we all know for a fact that we have tremendous, feedstock and industrial potential, right? But investors here, the issue here is about we face fragmented mandates, and also certification systems, and uncertain price signals, so on and so forth. So I think ultimately, to sum up, the lesson here isn't really about trying to give SAF more subsidies, because how sustainable could that be in the long run, right? So it should be more of policymakers should think of more, it's how to design the market so that a developer can actually start to finance a plant, instead of just giving out pure subsidies that way for long-term sustainable growth. Yeah.
All right, I think we're almost right on time. Just to close this off, I want to request a one-word answer from you on this question. In terms of the outlook for APAC for the next year, are you guys neutral, positive, or not so hopeful for the next 1 year? You can start with Kenneth.
Sure. Just one word, right? I would say positive. Yeah.
All right.
Because of what's to come in Singapore and Japan. Yeah.
Sounds good. Arnaud?
Ultra positive. We see a lot of project development coming up with improved bankability through some program like Finvest as incubators, and financial institutions considering SAF higher on the top list to allocate capital. So yeah, definitely positive.
Melvin?
Yes, positive as well. I think we start to see the momentum between the different countries within the region adopting their own SAF mandates. So it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out in the next few years.
All right, to round this conversation off, Isabel.
Yeah, I'm gonna say a few words, seeing as nobody stuck to the one word. I think positive, but I think we will start to see the realities of some of the policies and what that actually means. So I think there may be a little bit of a reality check as well, particularly from a SAF volume perspective.
All right, that's great. Thank you everyone for being on this panel. It was great speaking to you, learning from you, and I think that's a unanimous positive outlook for APAC with some caution, as Isabel said. And hopefully when we meet later this year at SAF Congress Singapore, we'll be able to discuss this further in person. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your time and a great discussion, and great to see so much positivity at the end there. As Shubhadeep said, hope that we see you in Singapore in person at the Marina Bay Sands from the 23rd to the 25th. And as mentioned, this recording will be sent to you after the discussion. I've seen some questions have been answered live already. If you do have a specific question, we will give the contact details for the speakers here today. Thank you very much for all of your time. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and hope to see you in Singapore at the end of the year. Thank you very much.